Friends, good to be together and welcome to our fifth session, our fifth webcast in our Reckless Love study. And as you can tell from the chat window tonight, we've been checking in and saying hello to one another and greeting each other. And it's good to be together. And we're very, very happy that you're here and joining in our study as well. No matter how you're connecting or when that is, just know that it's a good thing that we are together. So glad for that. Just checking my other media sources. I've got some other communication coming in, but I think it's going to have to just kind of wait, so that's okay. Yeah. I'll get back to that later, so that we'll put that on hold for now. Let me turn my watch off too. I got watches and phones and computers and everything happening. So that's the kind of world in which we live, right? It sure is. So, as I say, we're here chapter 5. And if you had a chance to do the reading, you'll know that the theme or focus for Tom Berlin in this session is that he's encouraging us to be in touch with who he refers to as the vulnerable. And, that's one of the places where he feels particularly that the command of Jesus to love our neighbor is very much at work. He's made the point all along, and Jesus did too, by the way. It's kind of easy to love those who love you. But what about those beyond that circle? Or those you don't even know, or those that you know little about and maybe feel like you don't want to know? And, what's the command of love have to say to us in those kinds of situations? So we'll do a little reflection on that here this evening. If you've got your book handy, and if you don't, that's okay. I'm going to read the references and kind of keep us together on this. But on page 95, and we'll actually come to that page in just a moment, but I wanted to pull out one sentence that Tom Berlin has almost in the, not quite middle of the page, but it's a sentence that kind of stands out there on its own. Again, page 95. He writes this, that the root of all conflict is a simple question of who's in and who's out. Just kind of let that settle in, sink in, kind of come beneath your hearing and maybe down into your heart. He's saying that the root of all conflict is the simple question of who's in and who's out. Now, he says simple question, and I get what he's pressing toward when he says it that way. But I also think it sounds simple, and sometimes it feels very complicated. And maybe that's part of the challenge. It is simple. It's simply determining that. And if we can determine that, or allow our decision about that to be impacted by both our faith and by God's activity in our life through the love of Christ, then maybe it is simple. And we've made it way too complicated. So regardless of how that statement hits you, I wanted to throw that out there and leave that be kind of at the start here tonight. And with that, to offer a prayer, as we've done each week, and I'd like to refer to the prayer that they provide. They have some, I think, helpful, prayerful words for us to center us in. And so I'm going to read the prayer that they give for this session and ask you where you are to join me as I read it for us. Let's pray. Generous God, you open your arms in love wider than we could ever open ours, or than we even often dare. May we sense the gracious presence of your Spirit in this time together, that we may discover ways to make the circles of those with whom we share your love ever larger, especially the vulnerable people in our world and in our lives, who need most to feel the transforming touch of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So the prayer is just what the author is having us focus on tonight, how we can widen the circle, of course, but also within that circle be particularly aware of, responsive to, and loving towards those who are vulnerable. So let's move into it. I mentioned page 95 in the book. I want to stay there. So if you've got the book there and you already have it open from our previous reference, look on that same page to the end of that section we were just in before the bottom section begins. And there's a couple of sentences there that I wanted to lift up, beginning with those who are most committed. So that's the statement that I want to start with and read to the end of that paragraph. Hear this with me. Those who are most committed, and I think this means in a religious sense, those who are most committed, if they're not careful, can become self-righteous and begin to think that they should control the doors that determine who's in and who's out. It is especially true if you think that you are in, not because of God's love or God's grace, but because you have made the right decisions and done the right things and taken your commitments seriously, unlike those other people out there. Okay, preacher. Preacher Tom. Wow. Yeah. So sometimes, he says, those of us who are particularly religiously committed, and that's a good thing, and yet what he's talking about is this trap that we can fall into, and then he describes it here. And it has to do then with those on the inside and those on the outside. So I wanted to put out a question and invite response, as we know how to do, and hope that you will tonight. And the question is, why do we think religious people tend to get caught in this trap of, as he says here, determining who's in and who's out? Why does that even come up as a priority or something that, we give thought and energy toward? And his point is, hey, we do. And so that's the question, and I invite your response around that. What makes that happen? What brings that on? Again, this tendency of those who are religiously committed or deeply focused on God and a life of faith. Why are we in this trap at times to decide who's in and who's out? Any thinking there that could help us? Sam says, Jesus warned the scholars and religious leaders at the time about keeping people out. So Jesus was on to us, right? That's what Sam's saying. Jesus pushed against this. He saw it at work. In what we call in the biblical world, the scribes and Pharisees are those self-righteous religious authorities. And I think what Tom Berlin is saying is, you know what? While that was true then, it's sort of true now. And Sue's saying, well, it's part of our human nature. In other words, I guess we can't help ourselves. It's somehow the way that, we're put together, or that we think. It's the way that we just kind of do this life thing. It's a natural kind of experience. Catherine says, because they can be very judgmental. These are the religiously committed folk, can be judgmental. And of course, that's us. And they're the best because of God's love, and they turn other people off. So it's the kind of the feeling that there's an elitism, sometimes religiously speaking, that we're loved, we're saved, we're included. God cares about us. God sees us. God's pleased with us. All of those kinds of ways of thinking, where it's focused on kind of where my position is in this. And what Catherine's saying is that can actually that's not a very good witness sometimes to others. Here's some things I was thinking about in response to the question. I thought that, we sometimes focus religiously on what's right. In other words, right thinking, right belief, but also right behavior. And that's what God's requiring of us, to get it right. And so when we get it right, it's sometimes important to recognize how right we are by also identifying who's got it wrong. Because when you note those who've got it wrong, that just solidifies the right way that we've got. And so it's that whole right-wrongness of it that can, in my feeling at least at times, take over and become the filter through which we think about our faith, ourselves, and others, right? Doug says, this is the LGBTQ issue, he says. It's in a nutshell, according to you, Doug, and thank you for putting this out there for us to think about. We have defined what Christianity is, and we want all other club members, I think he's putting that in quotes, to fit our template. So, that's certainly one of the issues that the church bounces up against, presses up against, and there are others, and we know them. And for some, in fact, for many, that's an issue of who's in and who's out, and wanting to draw those lines in circles in that way. So again, that rightness and wrongness was something I was thinking about. Another thought that I had is that it's actually, I got to be careful how I say this. Sometimes it's difficult to put into words always what's in your mind. Do you ever have that trouble? I know I do. But this is what I'm thinking. I'll try to say it. It's actually easier when it comes to our faith if we simply identify what we should do. It's easier because then we can do it, it's done, and to put it in a very crass term, we're good to go. So if you remove lists or categories of behavior from the equation, then it becomes less clear, what it means to be faithful, for instance, and we're uncomfortable with that. So we want to continue to kind of make it manageable, identifiable, list it down, check it off, and in that way, there's some confidence that we're doing what God intends. Now, we're speaking very frankly and honestly, which is what we want to do in a webcast like this. And I'm just, trying to share out of my own heart what I think sometimes is the trap or tendency that we have as religious people. Karen Curran says, I'm not sure why those of faith are more judgmental, but you would think that we should be those who are the least judgmental, says Karen. And she liked TB's discussion at Tom Berlin's about his thoughts with people with tattoos. And we're going to get to that. He does have that in his chapter here about how he used to think about people with tattoos. So Karen, we'll hold that and get to that before we end tonight. Catherine says, our why only, in other words, makes us wear blinders. I don't know if I read that quite rightly, or that's Carol, I guess. Yes, Carol, whether you typed that correctly or if I understood it. So maybe you can clarify exactly what you mean there. But I think I get the blinder part, that we can become very narrow sometimes in our thinking. Carol Cretion says, you're late. And you don't have to apologize. We're just glad you're here. So welcome, Carol. Kathy says, validation of being in includes identifying who's out. So that says it in one sentence what I rattled on about, which, sometimes to know we're good is to identify those who aren't good. And that, going back to Sue Sheets' comment about the human nature, that might be part of what you were saying there, Sue, that's kind of our tendency, is to clarify things for ourselves by qualifying things for others, right? Okay. Kathy said it right. All right. We'll go with that, Carol. Thank you. Okay. Hey, let's move on. We could go on a while with this one, but let's keep going. On page 96 in the book, I'm just going to keep moving through here for another moment. He's talking about, Tom Berlin is our author, about limiting our circles. And it gets a little bit at what I was mentioning just earlier, how that actually can make it seem for us to be easier to love. So in the first full paragraph near the top quarter or so of the page, there's a sentence in the middle of that paragraph that goes this way. If we get really good at saying who is out, now let's just pause there. Wow. Is that what we want to get good at? I'm not sure. But he says, when we do, if we do, get really good at saying who is out, we can whittle down considerably the number of people we believe God calls us to love. And then at the end of the paragraph he says, in this way, we realize that the opposite of love may not be hate, but unyielding neglect. Wow. So when we get good at this in and out stuff, particularly identifying those who are out. Now let me just pause here to say, this is uncomfortable stuff. But it's important, isn't it? To think about. It's a challenge to us. It causes self-reflection. At least I know that it does for me. And I'm, hoping and praying that I'm not alone in this and that you're feeling some of the push of this too, because that can open us up to some new ways of thinking, certainly new ways of living with others and responding and reacting to others. So what he's saying here is, though none of us want to be the champions at determining who's out or in, we have some practice with that, quite frankly. And determining who's in, when that circle becomes closer, then the scope of how far our love has to go or how hard we have to work at it, it actually becomes easier. And then he describes the reaction or our relating to the others then, or that are kind of pushed out, not as that we hate them, but he says here almost in a more deeply tragic way that we just neglect them. So in other words, we just don't see, we may not see them, or we may not care, or we may not want to know anymore, that kind of thing. And of course there are stories of Jesus where he tells the parables of those who would walk by the sick and the broken and as if they didn't even see them there. Thinking of the man at the gate of the rich man. So, this is part of our reality, and we're challenged, I think, here by this particular chapter to give some reflection to it. Some comments are coming in. I don't want to miss those as I'm sharing my own thoughts. So let me make sure I pick up some of the things you're thinking. Catherine says, we're not willing to accept all people, and that makes us then lose out. Yeah. Sue says, since you've been on your journey of faith, you become less judgmental. And isn't that just like God? And not only in your life, Sue, but in all of our lives, to change us, to soften us in some ways, to make us more pliable so that we can be shaped. If you think of the potter, we're the clay. And rather than be hard and rigid, we're softer. And like you're saying, we can become less judgmental. And certainly we know that's possible with God. Janine says, Tom Berlin's pointing out that the problem of judging others, that we become God or think we're like God, and ultimately keeps us from loving and accepting others. So we kind of put ourselves in a position of authority and privilege that perhaps, first of all, we may not deserve, or in the sense that may not be where God wants us to be. And then, as she says, take on this role of God, we miss the real place where God wants us to be, which is in relationship with each other, and a loving relationship, I should say. All right. So, good conversation, and I appreciate it very much. And let's go ahead and move forward. And I'd like to lift up now, I'll actually direct our attention, I should say, to the video, as we have a video clip every week. And in tonight's clip, Tom Berlin's going to pick up a friend who, his name is Mohammed. He is originally from Sierra Leone. He speaks English well, but with an accent, a pretty thick accent. So you'll see some subtext below to kind of help us fully understand what he's saying, because he's got some very good things to say. So I know you'll appreciate the video, and then we'll be back and pick up our discussion together as we keep moving forward through session 5. I wonder if the Hubers are still with us. They've been awfully quiet out there. So yeah, they were at least earlier in our webcast. Sandy and Brian hooked on from their campground in West Virginia. So I made a kind of a joke that they were using a coat hanger and a piece of foil, and maybe a strong wind came through and they're down now. But anyway, it was nice to hear from him earlier on our session. So without further ado, let's go to the video and take a listen. I know you'll enjoy it.
Today I'm picking up Muhammad Nabiyu. Muhammad is a young man who lives in Sierra Leone, Africa. When I first met Muhammad, he was 12 years old, and he was a child who had been deeply impacted by the civil war in Sierra Leone. He was actually picked up in the marketplace as a child who was homeless. He grew up in a ministry of the United Methodist Church called the Child Rescue Center. Today, at 28, Muhammad is the director of the Child Rescue Center. He completed his education, he went to college, finished his college degree, then became the director of the Child Rescue Center. If there's anybody I know who understands what it is to be vulnerable, but also work every day with the vulnerable, it's Muhammad. But I'm really excited for you to meet him. Hey, Nat, great to see you, man.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Sure.
Muhammad, talk a little bit about what you do.
Well, I work at the Child Rescue Center as the director of the organization. The Child Rescue Center transforms lives, unlock potentials, develop leaders, and strengthen families. We take care of the most vulnerable population of our country, including both families as well as children.
Okay, Muhammad, you are a very humble guy, and I know that, but what you just shared sounds more like your brochure than really what you do every day. You care for over 600 kids, you and your staff, and you provide education, you provide medical care, and as a result, they're not in child labor. But I also know something else about you, and thanks for letting me share this. You were once one of those children who was so vulnerable. Your father was shot by rebels during the Sierra Leone Civil War. You were there, you saw that. You ran into the bush with others, and you lived on your own for a period of months and years, and ended up in a marketplace where the director of the Child Rescue Center found you. So you know exactly what it's like to be one of the children whose care you're a part of today.
So my story with living through this dramatic event really helped to shape my life, to be able to know that, okay, God cares and He values everyone. God values people that we don't even care about, even though He knows our darkest moments. But He loves us anyway, above all things.
You know, Muhammad, the nice thing about your story, you have lived vulnerability. You were the child in the bush, you were the child in the market who was later brought into through the ministry of the United Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people who have experienced hardship have just a unique lens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, if you've never been vulnerable, it's important to be humble. That makes a big difference.
It does. I have learned to work with my staff. We call it the Iceberg Principle. You have a small part of the iceberg tipping out from the ocean, and then you have the rest under the surface of the water. It's there. So most times, we do not even see what is under. We only see on top. And even it's biblical, it's in the Bible, it says things that are unseen is internal. You see it there. And those are much more rewarding. And sometimes, instead of us rushing into conclusion or being judgmental of people, we may want to really go closer to them and really understand what is underneath the iceberg. What are those feelings? What are the underlying pressures?
My experience is compassion is what drives me deeper under the waterline.
Yes.
In your image. You're right. Judgment is up here, but compassion is down here, because until I understand what are all the things that have affected this situation, what's going on in this person's life, there may be 100 things I never thought of.
You never thought of.
But I have to have enough compassion and kindness and curiosity.
That can change your life.
Yeah. I love the word curious.
Yes.
Because it implies humility.
It does.
It just says, look, I know I don't know.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
I'm here.
I'm questioning because I'm trying to understand.
Yes.
That's what I like about the word curious.
It's very important. Once you become curious, then you start to know about this person more. And then what happens? Opportunities start opening up to say, how can you make an impact?
Yeah, because
how do you change that? Every day is an opportunity to change your life. Every day is an opportunity to see somebody. Even by your mere words. You see somebody standing, you talk to the person. How many times we go to church, we all sit with our family next to each other. After service, we are gone. Do we even take time to even shake hands with other person next to us and ask questions and talk to them?
As you say that, I'm thinking about your image again of this iceberg. And sometimes what we see above the waterline is a mess.
It is.
And we judge it and we're like, how did it get to be such a mess? And we don't know what's happening under the waterline. But then let me flip that around.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we look above the waterline and we say, oh, that everything's fine with that person.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yes.
they've got it going so well. But
That
in fact, under the waterline,
Things
they
are
may
not
be
good.
really struggling.
They are.
Right? So I think part of everybody helping every day,
Yeah.
everybody who's just wanting to be love to others, is you've got to be willing to sort of find out what's going on with people. And
Yes.
one of the things I have to realize is Jesus and Tom is not.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't have, like, Jesus sees people, he already knows their story.
Yeah.
He knows what's below that waterline.
Uh-huh.
So the curiosity becomes very important, because in the curiosity is where I become Christ-like.
Mm-hmm.
By caring enough to ask, because listen, if you're curious, it takes time, it takes attention.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important piece. And the more curious and caring I become, the more that changes me. And I really learn to love God by loving my neighbor.
We are Christians, we are Christ-like. We want to follow him. And look at all what he will engage with people who are out of his clan, who is out of his tribe, and reach other people. So if you don't really go to a person, there are some people there who have been waiting for years. They only want somebody to talk to them, somebody to just sit and listen to them. They are not asking you to solve all their problems. Just listen. They want somebody to say, oh, you care. People don't care how much we know until they really know how much we care.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
true.
they realize that. That's so important.
Yeah. So then you have to engage. You have to decide there is something I can do. I can't do everything, and I certainly can't do everything for everybody.
That's true.
When I'm looking to serve Christ, he gives me an opportunity.
Yeah.
And
see,
I find he doesn't make me do everything, but he expects me to do something.
people are thinking that, oh, I need to do something big. No. Sometimes the smallest things we do have the largest impact.
Yeah.
We don't even recognize that.
Waiting for the big is often the excuse
Yes.
for not doing the small.
Yeah, you do not. I've
Yeah.
always told my staff, do not wait for the perfect moment.
Yeah.
Take this moment you have now and make it perfect. Sometimes tomorrow never comes.
Because this
Prepare for today.
is the moment Jesus gives you.
This is the moment you are
Yeah.
in, and you may not see tomorrow. This is the moment, and let's stop arguing about waiting for the good people or how people can become good. You be the good person. You be the change you want to see in the world.
What's the closing challenge that you would give people, or the closing piece of advice you might offer?
My advice is this. I know we are living in a world that is so demanding of our time, of our resources. And I know we always want to do big things. I think there are so many opportunities every day. Every day we wake up is a new day to change our lives, to make something better, to save somebody's life. So I think my advice is we go out there and continue to do what we can do to make other people's life better. Let us remember the iceberg story, the tip of the iceberg story. Let us stop judging people from the surface and try to take time, to be curious. My other advice is let us always learn to enjoy our journey. We focus too much on the destination sometimes. Where are we going? But let us learn to enjoy the journey along the way. Like Jesus, we read in the book how many times he stopped by the way to help people, to do something for other people, to help people. He stopped in the heat of the day to help the Samaritan woman. He stopped to heal somebody. He stopped to ask somebody, question that changed his life forever. So wherever you are, it's not your final destination. It might be a practice ground for you. God is preparing you for another place. Yeah. So you look at what you have.
You're on the road all the time.
Impact. You are. Yeah. So it's very important. I always look at that.
Muhammad, it's been great spending this time with you and taking this drive. And I really think this image of the iceberg that you've given us is really helpful. I'm really grateful for the life you live and the things you do.
Thank
and
you.
so thank you for blessing people.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you
and
very
thanks
much.
for being here today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Hey, it was good to meet Mohammed, and yeah, quite an interesting life he's led, full of challenges, of course. Challenges, gosh, we could never even begin to imagine, I know. And yet, look at how God's worked in his life, and how those who've loved him have made such a difference in him, and now he's able to extend that love into the lives of so many others. So quite a remarkable person, and very encouraging to hear his story. One of the things, well, first of all, I liked that metaphor, the image that he had around the iceberg. That we just see the tip of somebody's life experience, and we don't know much about what's unseen or hidden beneath the surface, and that's a humbling thing. So both Catherine and Sue were kind of taken by Mohammed's message as well, which I understand. You see the question that I put up after we saw that video, and that is, what happens when we replace judgment with curiosity? And so Carol's got a response already to that, and hopefully some others of us can be thinking and responding too. She says that we have a tendency then to listen and not just talk. Again, with curiosity being the first thing that we offer somebody instead of offering judgment. Are there other thoughts about what difference that can make as we respond to others, what it makes possible, some of the changes that maybe it brings to our situation, and it is in our relationship with those around us? Let me give you some of the things that I was thinking about. I had two my notes, Carol, about the listening as opposed to the kind of speaking. So that's clear. Carol says we learn so much, so we're one of the outcomes, if you will, out of curiosity is an openness to learn, and an openness to be, a part of what's happening. Janine says when we replace judgment with curiosity, we're open to listening to people who are different from us. And so we then become vulnerable and then open to change ourselves. So that curiosity seems to complement, or at least enhance, our ability to be open to others. That's a good thing. Catherine says, always feel just smiling at someone can make their day. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too, as Tom Berlin does, just being kind, but asking them about their lives, if it's not too intrusive, it shows God's love. So I think Tom Berlin, at least here in this section, and with his ride there with Muhammad, it would be a great example of asking people their story. And so I think that goes hand in hand with the curiosity element. And that says we may gain some new perspectives, or something that we hadn't thought about before or brushed off. Then instead, now we consider it maybe in a new way or a fresh way. And, that can be important. Karen Curran's got a comment here. There it is. Judgment shuts down caring and compassion. So judgment shuts doors, to use the metaphor that kind of runs throughout the chapter, and curiosity opens that up. So there it is. If you want to be closed off, go ahead and throw the judgments out there. If you'd like to be more open and see what possibilities lay out beyond your own experience and thinking, then maybe curiosity is a better approach, right? Sure. Shelley says, when we dig deeper and take the time to know people, we develop a more meaningful relationship and become more compassionate towards others. I like that phrase you have there, Shelley, of digging deeper. That fits with their iceberg analogy. If we just stay on the surface, because judgments pretty much are what they are, and they kind of seal the moment. This is it. It really is a black and white issue. The curiosity side, as Shelley's saying, helps us go deeper and discover things that we otherwise would not hear, know, see, or experience. So that's pretty cool. Sue says, I've become very open with others who have different life choices than you have. And that's the whole idea we're talking about here, of trying to be open to things that are otherwise outside of our experience. And that includes meeting and knowing people who are outside of our experience. All right. Excellent. Well, let's move forward. I wanted to come back to the book and look at page 98 together. In page 98, there was an interesting section that kind of made me pause and reflect for a few moments when I came to it. And I'm looking at the last full paragraph on page 98. And after his initial sentence there, Tom Berlin writes, I know Jesus told me not to judge others, but I find it nearly impossible not to be judgmental of people who I think are being judgmental. Oh, I had to read that several times. And mostly because, not that I don't understand what he's saying. I read it several times because I thought, oh gosh, this is like in the preaching business. It's the difference between preaching and meddling. That hit a little close to home for me. How about for you? Jesus says don't judge, and yet, as he says here, it's so difficult not to be judgmental toward those who I think are being judgmental. I'm not sure how to break out of that cycle, except to acknowledge it humbly and maybe ask for forgiveness, to confess. But I've often thought, and I've talked about it with others over the years, that when we have a desire to be inclusive, the work of inclusivity it can, and maybe in most cases when it's most deep and authentic, it does involve also finding a space for those who not just look differently than I do, but includes those who think differently than I do. And that's the part about judging those who I perceive are judging, that it becomes really hard. Sometimes we are passionate about being inclusive as long as all those who are inclusive think just like we do. And of course, by the very nature of that, we then exclude others. So there's a real tension sometimes in deep inclusivity that seeks to have a pretty broad and wide tent in which many can come under and be a part of it and be on the inside. And then we struggle with our differences in love, I suppose, is the whole idea. So that's really hard. In fact, at the top of page 99, our author goes on to say there in that first paragraph with the first sentence, it is not easy to open yourself up to others, and here's the point, especially when the other person requires extra effort. Wow. So sometimes the way we say that is, it's tough to love the unlovable, or those we perceive are unlovable. Catherine says she feels that way, kind of cliquish people who stay in their own circle and leave other people out. Again, yes, this is, we're calling it like it is. We're not making this stuff up, are we? This is real life. We've all been on both sides of these challenges and these issues. So again, we have to be cautious not to judge those that we think are judgmental. We really are trying to hold a mirror up to ourselves and see our own reflection, and where part of these issues that Tom Berlin is identifying are at work in us. So it's requiring a very honest look at our lives. And it's challenging sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, it's challenging to love those who are difficult to love. So that little section, it just took up a small portion of the chapter, but it did make me stop and made me think. And so I have a question for you, get some response from you on this in regards to those items that we just touched on. What are some ways of thinking? What are some aspects of reflection, or at least ways of putting things together in our minds that could help us to get past the hurdle of working to love those who are hard to love? Is there something that we could be focused on, or some thought in our minds that we can lift up, hold on, reflect on, or at least some way of creating attitudes that could help us get past that? In the computer technology business, there's always these articles that give you tips and tricks, and how to do all of this better. So not that I'm looking, to trick ourselves, but I'm just trying to think if there's some coaching that we can do, and something that we can do. Hey, Sandy. Is that the number 18? Not sure what that is. Oh, deleted that message. Okay. All right. So, any thoughts or ideas? I know the question's probably not coming very good. Sam says one of the things we could think about, and that's what my mom used to tell me. So thanks, Sam. Focus on the positive. So, when we encounter other people, we see other people, and yes, they're different from us, and there's, maybe even some things that we're bothered by, but Sam's saying, yeah, but there's good stuff in there too. So why not start there? Why not focus on the positive aspects of that person's life? Sam says Sue says, in addition to what Sam has said, that we can look at the good qualities in those who are difficult to love. So that same idea of looking at the good qualities. Other responses, I'd love to hear from you. I'm just going to look down at my notes to see some of the things that I was thinking about when I put that question together. And one of the things I have in my notes is that a way of thinking that can help us is to think of Christ. I know a preacher would say that, right? But think about what Christ has done for us. And Christ didn't look at us and focus on what was wrong with us and let that be a barrier, but actually, in spite of what is wrong with us, loved us immensely anyway. So Christ is the model here. Harry says, love the unlovable. Just switch it around. Kathy says, judgment grows from the fear of the unknown. It grows from the lack of understanding. It's back to the importance of following through on curiosity, which we talked about earlier, helping us to understand and expand, she says, our capacity to love. So it's all about moving farther out. It's all about furthering into the world the reality of this love of God in Christ. Catherine says, to have one of them in the family. She says she has one in the family, hard to love. The good things that she does is overlook our personality differences. Yeah. Sometimes it's a matter of choice. What are we going to choose to focus on? And sometimes it's a matter of practice. We just have to keep practicing, focusing on those good parts. Now, in none of this discussion are we saying it's easy. We all get it. Sometimes it's just darn hard. Some would say sometimes it feels impossible. So we're not belittling that. We're not disregarding that, but we're saying, there are some things perhaps we could take on in our thought process to help us. Brian says helps to remember that all are created in the image of God. So not only is there what Christ has done for us, but the fact that that person is also a child of God. So when we see them, instead of seeing the negative, instead of seeing the less than qualities, we see them, Brian says, as a child of God. And if we are able to do that, practice doing that, putting that into our pattern of response with others, we can't help but change the way that we respond to them. Brian, thank you for that. Carol says, forget the unlovable and be lovable. In other words, just do it. That's a whole other campaign, I know, but that's kind of what you're saying, Carol, is, hey, okay, they're hard to love. You know what? Get over it. Love them anyway. Oh, Brian says that was Sandy's comment. You know what, Sandy? Now that I think about it, that was very much like a deacon. So I appreciate your comment. Thank you, Brian, for helping to communicate Sandy's comment to us. Shelley says, focus on the parts that are common, unite among us, the things that unite us rather than divide us. So again, that's It's getting beneath the surface. That's sharing stories. That's learning about one another, understanding the context of each other's lives. The things that Shelley's talking about there, that is an opening up so that we experience the other person, as a human being, as was said earlier, a child of God. And in recognizing that and then experiencing that, as Shelley's saying, there's some solidarity that's created there. Sam says Jesus died on the cross for all, even, Sam says, the unlovable. Okay. Thank you for that. Hey, I want to move to some of the last parts of the chapter. And in the last part of the book, he, as he's been doing each chapter, kind of gives us some practical things to think about that can help us. He kind of coaches us. On page 105, he starts this last section of the chapter. And there it is again. We talked about it earlier, so we won't hit that very hard right now. But he talks about this curiosity aspect. And actually, there's one part of that I do want to kind of dig a little deeper with you. On page 106, we mentioned stories, sharing of stories. And I want to do a little bit more thought with you on that, have us think together. There at the top of the page, he says, speaking of what Jesus has in mind for us, he says, knowing people's stories ignites the caring God desires for us to extend. That's an interesting sentence. When we know their stories, he says, it ignites, in other words, sets on fire within us this very thing that God then desires for us to share with others. So it's a catalyst, the sharing of the stories. So I just wanted to break that down a little bit and ask the question, what is it about knowing people's stories that ignites that desire of God in us then to share? Why is sharing stories such an important aspect? And as you're thinking about that, remember in the chapter he talks about how he used to react to people. This Karen Curran, I think, brought this up earlier in our session. He talked about how he used to respond to people who had tattoos. He would just make a blanket judgment, and it was not positive. It was kind of a negative about their lifestyle and what they valued and the kind of person they were and the kind of life they led. And he just decided all of that because he'd see their tattoo. And over time, he realized how judgmental and self-righteous that was. And now what he has done over the years, he says, is he's God's worked on him with that, is he now asks people to tell him about their tattoo. And that brings a whole story to life. So in that saying, that one of the things happens when we share stories like that is we sense common ground. Hey, spiritually speaking, maybe there's a sister or brother right there in front of me. Though we come from such different places and have such different backgrounds and look differently from each other, there's this commonality as we share stories of our life experience, and that can be just a wonderful thing. Sue says when we hear people's stories, you can more easily understand what makes them tick. Yeah, we get to know them and know about them and learn things we can appreciate about them and learn from them about things that can enrich our own life. Yeah, Catherine says listening to their stories makes them feel wanted and loved and cared about. So if we say, tell me about that. Hey, share with me. You have a story that goes with that? What's been your experience? We ask. And those kinds of open-ended questions then communicate things right away. First of all, I'm listening, or I'm ready to listen. Secondly, I think you're interesting. You're a person worth knowing more about. So we communicate value our sense of value for the other just by engaging in that kind of tell me about yourself question. I think Tom Berlin's onto something here. Janine says, when you hear someone's story, Janine says, you realize that you are not all that different from that person. Again, that sense of solidarity that we've been talking about. That if you struggle with insecurities, their desire to be loved and belong, all of the things that are a part of you, you're going to discover some of that in them. And then you've got someone you can share some experience with. Karen says you learn their true life story instead of the one that you think or perceive it to be. Isn't that interesting? Karen is saying, a lot of times, back to the iceberg thing for a minute, we see what's on the iceberg and then we craft in our mind, we think we know what's under the surface. We know what's going on. We know why they're in the situation that they're in. We know why they're the kind of person that they are. We just assume that we have all of those unseen pieces already figured out. And Karen says, when we actually, whoops, I just dropped my book on the floor, pardon me. Sorry about that. Karen says that when we actually listen for their story and hear it for the authenticness and the truthfulness that it represents, then we really know them, who they are. And our relationship with them then is based on that authenticity, which in my experience in life is always better. I mean, always. Shelley says, you learn more about a person, then you have the potential to develop more connections. And as you connect, the more you tend to care. It's this wonderful chain reaction of compassion, value, respect, and relationship. Yeah, Shelley, I like the way you put that together. That's helpful. Doug says listening to their stories will make them real people to us. We encounter them as the person God has created them to be, Doug's saying, and not just the character that we assume them to be. So it really breaks down a lot of barriers and a lot of assumptions, and quite frankly, it straightens a lot of wrong thinking when we invite others to tell us their story. Gosh, I think about a number of the issues that we struggle against culturally and religiously. Race relationships, that's still very much something that we as a culture are in the midst of. And when you hear the story of a person of color, then you really get to kind of know some of the context. Part of the whole thing about breaking down racism is hearing from those who have experienced it, what that's like, and helps those of us who haven't experienced it to learn, and not just to be sensitive to it, but then to kind of walk alongside and create partnership in that. Here he says, when you listen to their story, you can relate, and when you relate, you develop relationship. There's that connection again. One thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next, and it goes deeper and deeper and becomes more meaningful and more meaningful. All right. Well, friends, we're just about at time, and I just want to thank you again for a good session. And gosh, the Huber's hanging on all the way from West Virginia. Technology is a miracle, and we're glad that they were able to be a part of the session tonight. And all of you who are closer by geographically, it's no less a miracle that we're connected the way we are tonight. I want to close by just sharing something out of the Facilitator's Guide. Let me get my page number. Not so much a closing prayer, but more aspects of our life that we might put into practice this week. And of course, asking God to help us do these things. There's just 4 kind of bullet point items I want to lift up just for you to hear them and to be prayerful about them. So we can ask God this: may we express curiosity about the stories and the lives of those around us, right? So that's something we could be open to and working on this week, or added to that, I suppose. to engage unfamiliar people and situations. In other words, to not back away, but actually to step into those opportunities we have to engage with somebody who's unfamiliar or a situation that's not one that we've really experienced before. Our tendency is to shy away. I'm a shy person, basically, at heart. I'll tell you all about that later. But, that's something that I know I struggle with, and maybe you do too. I'd rather just kind of turn away if it's something I don't know. And he's saying we could pray to God to help us to kind of engage that. Also, here's another one. Pray that we could have expectations for the people that we help to take part in their healing. And so, in other words, not just to do one thing or express one act of kindness, but is there a way, God, that we can partner and be, with them, those who are needing help, who are part of our lives, to really assist them in, moving forward. And then the last thing, and he talks about this in his book, is offer an act of kindness. He spent some time at the end, and we ran out of time tonight to really focus on it, but he said, don't ever underestimate the power of the small things, the small acts of kindness. Someone earlier said, I think it was Catherine perhaps, offering a smile to somebody, or opening the door for someone, or helping someone carry something. Obviously, this whole COVID thing has made us, stay distant from one another, but there might be other ways, I know one of the things that I kind of practice is opening doors. Intentionally, I know somebody's behind me as I'm walking into a building. I'll pause and step aside and open the door for them and let them go through. Just something I like to do. And I bet you have small things that you do too, acts of kindness. It can go a long, long way. Harry says, lastly here, to be a positive influence upon everyone that you come in contact with. So do something kind, do something that's life-giving, create an attitude that we share with them, and let that happen not just once or twice, but Harry says, with everyone that we come in contact with. All right. Well, friends, it's been good. Thank you for, again, connecting, and we're going to sign off. Guys, this is session 5. We just have one more to go in this round, and I'll send you the link as usual. So be looking for that next week. Chapter 6, session 6. Until then, take care. Have a good night.